Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you appreciate your bed a little more. We are diving deep into the strange, unsettling, and downright bizarre world of medieval sleep. Forget everything you think you know about a good night's rest. In the Middle Ages, sleep was not just different. It was dangerous, disgusting, and often deadly. So before you get comfortable in your clean sheets and climate-controlled bedroom, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You have just woken up in the year 1325. And your first realization is that you have no idea what time it is. There are no alarm clocks, no phones buzzing on the nightstand, no digital numbers glowing in the darkness. Time, as you know it, simply does not exist in any practical sense for the average person. The medieval world ran on the rhythm of the sun and the sound of church bells. If you were a peasant, your day began when the rooster crowed and light started creeping through the cracks in your walls. That is it. That is your alarm, a bird screaming at you from the yard. But here is where things get interesting. Medieval people did not sleep the way we do today. They did not go to bed at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6 a.m. for a straight 8 hours. No, they practiced something called biphasic sleep, or segmented sleep. This was so common that no one even questioned it. Here's how it worked. You would go to sleep shortly after sunset, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m. You would sleep for about 4 hours, and then, around midnight or 1 a.m., you would wake up. Naturally, on purpose. This was not insomnia. This was normal. During this wakeful period, which could last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, people did all sorts of things. Some prayed, some had sex, some visited neighbors, others tended to the fire, checked on livestock, or just lay in bed thinking, talking, or staring into the darkness. There are medieval texts, prayers, and even medical advice written specifically for this midnight waking period. It was so embedded in the culture that it had its own name in different languages: first sleep and second sleep. Then, after this quiet middle-of-the-night interlude, you would go back to sleep for another 4 hours or so until dawn. And that was it. That was a full night of rest in medieval times. No one worried about it. No one called it sleep disorder. It was just life. So if you ever wake up in the middle of the night and cannot fall back asleep immediately, do not panic. You are not broken. You might just be experiencing a little echo of your ancestors' sleep patterns, whispered across the centuries. Now that we have covered when medieval people slept, let's talk about where they slept. And spoiler alert, it was not pleasant. Forget your memory foam mattress, your Egyptian cotton sheets, or even a basic bed frame. In medieval times, most people slept on what can only be described as organic garbage piles. Your bed, if you were lucky enough to have one, was a wooden frame. Maybe. More often, it was just a pile of straw or hay thrown directly onto the dirt floor. Yes, dirt. Your bedroom floor was literally the ground. Cold, damp, crawling with insects, and occasionally soggy from rain leaking through the thatched roof. The straw mattress was not some charming rustic experience. It was lumpy, it poked you, and it smelled like a barnyard, because it came from a barnyard. After a few weeks, the straw would flatten, get moldy, and start to rot. Changing it was a big event, assuming you had access to fresh straw in the first place. If you were slightly better off, you might stuff your mattress sack with feathers, wool, or moss. Sounds cozy, right? Wrong. These materials also attracted bugs, held moisture, and developed their own unique smells over time. Your bed was essentially a living ecosystem of mildew, lice, fleas, and whatever else decided to move in. Pillows were rare. If you had one, It was probably a sack filled with straw, rags, or more feathers. Most people just rested their heads on a wooden block, a rolled-up cloak, or their own arm. Blankets were heavy wool, unwashed for months, maybe years. They were scratchy, stiff with dirt and sweat, and they weighed about as much as a small dog. But they were essential, because your home had zero insulation, and the cold was relentless. Sheets, if they existed at all, were rough linen that rubbed your skin raw. Washing them required hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing with ash or lye, and then waiting days for them to dry. Most people just did not bother. So picture this. You are lying on a pile of crunchy, musty straw, covered by a wool blanket that smells like wet sheep, with no pillow, no mattress pad, and the floor beneath you radiating cold like a medieval refrigerator. And you are supposed to sleep, for hours, every single night. Welcome to medieval bedtime. It only gets worse from here. Let's talk about privacy, or more accurately, the complete absence of it. In the modern world, we take for granted that bedtime is a private affair. You close your bedroom door, maybe lock it, and enjoy your personal space. In medieval times, that concept did not exist. Most peasant families lived in a one-room house. One room for cooking, eating, working, and yes, sleeping. The entire family shared this space. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even extended relatives all crammed together. Beds, when they existed, were shared, not just by couples, but by entire families. It was common for parents and several children to sleep in the same bed. Sometimes cousins or visiting relatives joined in. Personal space was not a thing. If you rolled over, you hit someone. If you snored, everyone heard it. If you had gas, well, everyone knew. But it was not just family. In many homes, especially during winter, livestock also came indoors. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. They were brought inside to share body heat and to protect them from thieves or predators. So your bedroom was also a barn. Imagine trying to fall asleep while a goat chews loudly 3 feet away from your head, or a pig snorts and shuffles around in the dark, or chickens roost in the rafters above you, occasionally dropping surprises onto your blanket. And let's not forget about guests. Medieval hospitality was serious business. If a traveler showed up at your door, especially in bad weather, you were expected to offer them shelter. That meant they slept in your house, in your room, possibly in your bed. Sharing a bed with strangers was completely normal. Inns and taverns operated the same way. You paid for a spot in a bed, not a private room. You might be sharing that bed with 2 or 3 other travelers you had never met. Men, women, it did not matter. Everyone just piled in. And because bathing was rare and hygiene was optional, your bed companions were often fragrant in the worst possible way. You just had to deal with it. Privacy, personal boundaries, alone time. These were luxuries that did not exist for the average medieval person. Sleep was a communal activity, whether you liked it or not. Now let's talk about the creatures that shared your bed. And we are not talking about your family or the livestock. We are talking about the tiny, relentless, blood-sucking monsters that made every night a battle. Fleas, lice, bed bugs, and an entire army of creepy crawlies. In medieval times, bugs were not just a nuisance. They were constant companions. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, noble, peasant. It did not matter. Your body was a buffet, and the bugs were always hungry. Fleas were everywhere. They lived in the straw mattresses, in the wool blankets, in your clothes, and in your hair. They hopped. They bit. They bred. Medieval people scratched constantly. It was just part of life. Some sources suggest people kept small sticks or pieces of bone specifically for scratching hard-to-reach bites. Lice were even worse. Head lice, body lice, pubic lice. They set up camp and refused to leave. Grooming sessions often involved picking lice out of each other's hair, a social activity that doubled as pest control. But the true nightmare was bedbugs. These little horrors hid in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the straw, in the walls. At night, they emerged to feast on sleeping humans. Their bites were itchy, painful, and numerous. And there was no real way to get rid of them. Medieval people tried everything. They burned herbs like wormwood or rue near the bed, hoping the smoke would drive bugs away. They rubbed themselves with oils or animal fat. They flipped and beat their mattresses. Nothing worked. Some desperate souls even resorted to sleeping on platforms suspended by ropes, thinking bugs could not climb up. Spoiler, they could. Bedbugs were so common that they were mentioned in medieval poems, medical texts, and even jokes. One old saying went, "Good night, sleep tight, do not let the bedbugs bite." Except in medieval times, they absolutely did bite. Every single night. And it was not just the bites. These bugs carried diseases. Fleas spread the plague. Lice spread typhus. Your bed was not just uncomfortable. It was a health hazard. So every time you climbed into your straw pile at night, you knew you were not sleeping alone. You were sharing your space with an entire ecosystem of insects, all eager to make you their midnight snack. Sweet dreams. Medieval people did not just battle bugs and discomfort. They also had to deal with the temperature. And let me tell you, it was brutal. There was no thermostat, no space heater, no electric blanket. You had fire, wool, and hope. That was it. Winter was the worst. Homes were built with wattle and daub walls, which is a fancy way of saying sticks covered in mud and dung. These walls had gaps, cracks, and holes everywhere. The wind howled through like it owned the place. Windows, if they existed, were not made of glass. Glass was far too expensive for regular people. Instead, windows were just holes in the wall, covered with oiled cloth, animal hides, or wooden shutters. None of these stopped the cold. They just made it slightly less direct. The floor was dirt, and dirt is an excellent conductor of cold. It sucked the warmth right out of your body. Some people laid down rushes or straw to create a thin barrier, but it did not help much. The only source of heat was the hearth, a central fire pit that burned wood, peat, or dried dung. The problem? The fire was never big enough, and it never lasted all night. Someone had to wake up in the middle of the night to add more fuel, or the fire would die out and everyone would freeze. Even if the fire stayed lit, it only warmed a small area. If you were lucky enough to sleep near the hearth, you might be warm on one side while the other side of your body slowly turned into ice. If you were sleeping further away, forget it. You might as well be camping outside. People layered everything they owned: tunics, cloaks, leggings, scarves, hats. They went to bed fully dressed, sometimes wearing more clothes than they did during the day. And they still shivered. Children, the elderly, and anyone already sick were especially vulnerable. Hypothermia was a real danger. People died in their sleep from the cold. It was not dramatic. It was just a quiet, freezing end. On the flip side, summer was no picnic either. Those same poorly ventilated homes turned into ovens. The thatch roofs trapped heat. The air was stagnant. There were no fans, no air conditioning, no ice, just sweat, flies, and misery. People tried to sleep outside when they could, but that came with its own risks. Wild animals, thieves, bugs, and the ever-present threat of getting caught in a sudden rainstorm. So whether it was winter or summer, medieval sleep was uncomfortable. Your body was either too cold or too hot, and there was nothing you could do about it, except endure. Let's talk about dreams, nightmares, and the supernatural fears that haunted medieval sleep. Because in a world without science, without electric lights, and without rational explanations for everything, the night was a deeply terrifying place. Medieval people believed that the boundary between the living world and the supernatural world grew thin at night. Demons, ghosts, fairies, and witches were thought to roam freely after dark, and when you were asleep, you were vulnerable. Nightmares were not just bad dreams. The The word nightmare literally comes from night and mare, an old term for a demon or evil spirit that sat on your chest while you slept, suffocating you and causing terrifying visions. People believed this was a real thing, not a metaphor. Sleep paralysis, a condition where you wake up but cannot move, was interpreted as demonic attack. You would lie there, frozen, feeling a crushing weight on your chest, sometimes seeing shadowy figures in the room. In medieval times, this was proof that a demon or witch was tormenting you. To protect themselves, people used all sorts of charms and rituals. They hung herbs like St. John's wort over the bed. They placed iron objects nearby because iron was believed to repel evil spirits. They said prayers before sleeping, asking saints for protection. Some people slept with a knife under their pillow, not to fight off human intruders, but to ward off supernatural ones. Crosses were carved into bed frames. Holy water was sprinkled around the room. Dreams themselves were taken very seriously. They were seen as messages from God, warnings from the dead, or omens of the future. A bad dream could ruin your entire day, because you would spend it trying to figure out what disaster it was predicting. Religious dreams were considered especially significant. If you dreamed of saints, angels, or the Virgin Mary, it was a blessing. If you dreamed of devils or hell, you needed to confess your sins immediately. Some medieval texts even offered dream interpretation guides, much like ancient dream dictionaries. Dreaming of water might mean trouble ahead. Dreaming of bread could signal prosperity. Dreaming of snakes, well, that was never good. But it was not just demons people feared. There was also the fear of dying in your sleep. Sudden death was terrifying because it meant you would not have time to confess your sins or receive last rites. Your soul could be trapped in purgatory or worse, dragged straight to hell. So people prayed before bed, asking God to let them wake up in the morning. Going to sleep was not just about rest. It was a nightly gamble with your immortal soul. Sleep, in the medieval mind, was not safe. It was a journey into darkness, both literal and spiritual, and you never knew what might be waiting for you there. Now let's talk about what happened when medieval people could not sleep. Insomnia was not a new invention. People in the Middle Ages struggled with sleeplessness just like we do today. But their understanding of it, and their treatments for it, were wildly different. Medieval medicine believed that sleeplessness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you could not sleep, it meant one of these fluids was out of whack, and the solution was to rebalance them. How did they do that? Bloodletting, of course. If a doctor believed you had too much blood, they would cut you open or apply leeches to drain some out. The idea was that this would calm your body and help you sleep. Did it work? Probably not. But it definitely made you weak and dizzy, which might have been mistaken for relaxation. Herbal remedies were also popular. Chamomile, valerian root, hops, and poppy were all used to promote sleep. Some of these actually work and are still used today. Others were just medieval guesswork. Poppy, in particular, was powerful. It contains opium, so it definitely helped people sleep. But it also came with side effects like addiction and overdose. Medieval people did not fully understand dosing, so things could go very wrong very quickly. For those who could not afford doctors or herbs, there were folk remedies. Drinking warm milk, eating lettuce, or placing a bag of lavender under your pillow were common suggestions. Some people believed that sleeping with your head facing east would help. Others thought you should avoid eating certain foods before bed, like beans, which were believed to cause nightmares. There was also the belief that your sleeping position mattered. Sleeping on your back was thought to invite demons. Sleeping on your stomach could suffocate you. The safest position, according to medieval wisdom, was on your right side. But not all sleeplessness was physical. Some believed it was spiritual punishment. If you could not sleep, maybe God was angry with you. Maybe you had committed a sin and your guilty conscience was keeping you awake. The solution: pray more, confess, do penance, Monks and nuns who followed strict schedules were expected to wake up multiple times during the night for prayers. This was called the divine office, and it meant their sleep was constantly interrupted. Insomnia, for them, was almost built into their lifestyle. Interestingly, the segmented sleep pattern we talked about earlier might have actually helped with insomnia. Because people expected to wake up in the middle of the night, they did not panic when it happened. They just got up, did something quiet, and went back to sleep. There was no stress about falling back asleep quickly because waking up was normal. In a strange way, medieval people might have had a healthier relationship with nighttime wakefulness than we do today. Let's talk about one of the strangest and most dangerous aspects of medieval sleep: the fear of being buried alive. This was not just a paranoid fantasy. It was a legitimate concern that haunted people's nightmares and shaped the way they thought about death and sleep. In medieval times, medical knowledge was limited. There were no stethoscopes, no EKGs, no reliable way to confirm that someone was truly dead. People sometimes fell into deep comas, cataleptic states, or conditions that mimic death. And in a world without modern medicine, mistakes were made. Stories circulated of people waking up inside their coffins, trapped underground, screaming for help that would never come. Some graves, when opened years later, showed scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, they terrified people. This fear bled into how people thought about sleep. Sleep was often called the little death because of how closely it resembled dying. You lay still. You closed your eyes. Your breathing slowed. To medieval people, the line between sleep and death felt dangerously thin. Some people were so afraid of being mistaken for dead that they made arrangements. Wealthy individuals might leave instructions to delay their burial for several days, just to be sure. Others requested that a vein be cut or a finger removed before burial. A gruesome but effective way to confirm death. There were also superstitions around how you slept. Sleeping too deeply was seen as suspicious. If someone could not be easily woken, people worried they might be slipping away. Loud snoring was actually reassuring because it meant you were definitely still alive. Medieval ghost stories often featured the theme of the unquiet dead, people who had been buried before their time and whose spirits could not rest. These tales reinforced the fear that death and sleep were uncomfortably close. Religious texts sometimes compared sleep to death in a more hopeful way. They called sleep a rehearsal for death, a nightly practice of surrendering your soul to God. When you woke up, it was like a small resurrection. This was meant to be comforting, but it also carried an ominous undertone. Every night could be your last. People prayed before bed not just for protection from demons, but also to ask God to let them wake up. It was a genuine concern. You might close your eyes and never open them again, either because you died in your sleep or because someone mistakenly thought you were dead and buried you. So sleep, in the medieval mind, was not just rest. It was a gamble, a liminal state between life and death. And every morning that you woke up was a small victory against the darkness. Let's shift to something a bit different: sleep and social status. Because in medieval times, how you slept, where you slept, and what you slept on were all markers of wealth and power. For peasants, as we have discussed, sleep was rough. Straw mattresses, dirt floors, shared beds, and livestock as roommates. But for the nobility, sleep was a completely different experience, though not as luxurious as you might think. Nobles slept in actual beds, raised off the ground, sometimes with carved wooden frames and curtains. These curtains were not just decorative. They provided privacy in castles where multiple people shared large rooms, and they helped trap warmth in drafty stone chambers. The mattresses were stuffed with feathers, wool, or down, much softer than straw. Nobles also had linen sheets, embroidered blankets, and pillows. Some even had fur covers for extra warmth. But here is the catch. Even noble beds were infested with bugs. Fleas and bedbugs did not discriminate. A fancy bed frame did not keep them out. Nobles just had more resources to replace bedding and try different remedies. But they still woke up scratching. Castles were cold, damp, and drafty. Stone walls and floors were even worse than dirt for holding cold. Fireplaces helped, but they were inefficient. Smoke filled the rooms. Nobles often slept in layers, just like peasants, because even wealth could not fully defeat medieval winter. The bed itself was a status symbol. The bigger and more ornate your bed, the more important you were. Kings and queens had massive beds, sometimes large enough to fit 6 or 8 people. These beds were stages for political theater. Important visitors might be received while the lord or lady was still in bed. Business was conducted, treaties signed, all from beneath the blankets. Privacy was still limited, even for the rich. Nobles often had servants sleeping in their rooms, ready to attend to their needs at any moment. The idea of sleeping completely alone was almost unheard of, even at the top of society. Sleeping arrangements also reflected power dynamics. In noble households, children, guests, and lower-ranking family members slept in less desirable spots, further from the fire, in smaller beds, or even on benches in the Great Hall. Monasteries had their own hierarchy. Abbots had private cells with actual beds. Regular monks slept in dormitories on simple cots or straw mattresses. Some orders required monks to sleep in their robes, fully dressed, to be ready for midnight prayers. So, while wealth made sleep more comfortable, it did not eliminate the fundamental challenges of medieval life. Everyone, from king to peasant, battled the cold, the bugs, and the darkness. Sleep was still hard. Some just had softer pillows, while they did it. Let's talk about sleep schedules in medieval monasteries, because monks and nuns had some of the strangest and most demanding sleep routines in history. Monastic life revolved around prayer, and prayer happened around the clock. Monks followed the divine office, a schedule of prayers that divided the day and night into specific hours. This meant sleep was constantly interrupted. The day began with matins, also called the night office, which took place in the middle of the night, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. Monks were woken from sleep, often by a bell or a designated brother shaking them awake, and they had to stumble through the cold, dark hallways to the chapel. Matins could last an hour or more. There were psalms, hymns, readings, all chanted in Latin while standing in a freezing stone church. Then, after matins, monks were supposed to return to bed for a few more hours before lauds, the dawn prayer. But here's the problem. By the time you walked back to your cell, got settled, and started to drift off, it was almost time to wake up again for lauds. So many monks just stayed awake, reading, praying, or meditating until the next service. This meant monastic sleep was fragmented, unreliable, and exhausting, and it was intentional. Sleep was seen as a weakness, a concession to the flesh. The truly devout were expected to sacrifice rest in service of God. Some saints and mystics took this even further. They practiced extreme sleep deprivation as a form of penance, sleeping only 2 or 3 hours a night, standing up, or even sleeping on stone floors without blankets. This was considered holy, a way to mortify the body and focus the soul. But not all monks were so enthusiastic. There are records of monks falling asleep during prayers, snoring during sermons, or sneaking extra naps during the day. Some monasteries had rules specifically forbidding monks from sleeping during work hours or lying down after meals. Punishments for falling asleep during prayer could be severe: public humiliation, extra fasting, or physical penance. But the exhaustion was real, and human nature is human nature. Interestingly, the monastic schedule might have aligned with the natural segmented sleep pattern we discussed earlier. Waking up for matins was essentially the same as waking up between first and second sleep. Monks just filled that time with prayer instead of conversation or chores. Still, monastic life was brutal on the body. Chronic sleep deprivation, combined with fasting, cold, and hard labor, took a toll. Many monks did not live long lives, and exhaustion was a constant companion. Sleep in the monastery was not rest. It was another form of discipline, another sacrifice offered up to God. Now let's talk about sleepwalking, night terrors, and other strange sleep behaviors that terrified medieval people. Sleepwalking was deeply unsettling to medieval minds. If someone got up in the middle of the night and wandered around with their eyes open but not truly awake, it looked like possession. People believed the soul had left the body, or that a demon had taken control. There are medieval accounts of sleepwalkers doing bizarre things, climbing onto roofs, walking into rivers, even leaving their homes and wandering into the night. Because no one understood the neurological causes, these episodes were interpreted as supernatural. Some believed sleepwalkers were being led by evil spirits, lured toward danger. Others thought the person was under a curse or had been bewitched. The solution? Prayer, exorcism, or binding the person to their bed to keep them from wandering. Night terrors were even worse. Imagine waking up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that something horrifying is happening. In medieval times, this was seen as clear evidence of demonic attack. Children were especially prone to night terrors, and parents were terrified by them. They believed their child was being tormented by demons or suffering from an illness sent by God as punishment. Remedies included hanging protective charms above the child's bed, sprinkling holy water around the room, or having a priest bless the child. Some parents resorted to tying small bells to the child's wrist, so they would wake up if they started to move in their sleep. There were also strange beliefs about how you should sleep to avoid bad dreams or supernatural interference. Sleeping with your mouth open was thought to let demons enter your body. Sleeping with your arms crossed was considered dangerous because it mimicked the pose of a corpse. Some people believed that if you dreamed of someone who had recently died, their ghost was visiting you. This could be comforting or terrifying, depending on your relationship with the deceased and how they appeared in the dream. Medieval medical texts also described a condition they called incubus, where a person felt a heavy weight on their chest while sleeping and could not move. This is what we now know as sleep paralysis, but back then, it was believed to be a demon literally sitting on you. Women, in particular, were thought to be vulnerable to a demon called an incubus, a male demon that attacked women in their sleep. Men could be attacked by a succubus, a female demon. These were not just myths. People genuinely believed they were happening. There were even recorded cases of people being accused of witchcraft because they claimed to have strange dreams or nighttime visions. The line between sleep, dreams, and reality was blurry, and anything unusual was grounds for suspicion. So sleep, once again, was not safe. It was a time of vulnerability, when the natural and supernatural worlds collided, and when anything could happen. Let's talk about how medieval children slept, because their experience was even more precarious than adults. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Many babies did not survive their first year, and one of the dangers they faced was something called overlaying, where a parent or sibling accidentally rolled onto a baby during sleep and suffocated them. Because families shared beds and space was tight, this was a real and tragic risk. The church took it so seriously that there were laws and sermons warning parents to be careful. Some blamed overlaying on the devil, claiming that demons caused parents to roll over onto their children. Others believed it was God's punishment for sin. To prevent this, some families used a device called an arcuccio, a wooden frame that was placed over the baby in the bed, creating a protective cage. It kept the baby safe from being crushed, but still allowed them to stay close for warmth and feeding. Children, once they were old enough to survive infancy, often slept in piles with their siblings. They shared blankets, body heat, and space. Privacy was not even a concept. You learned to sleep through noise, movement, and discomfort because there was no alternative. Older children, especially boys, might be sent away to apprentice with tradesmen or to serve in noble households. There, they slept wherever they were told, often on the floor, on a bench, or in a shared bed with other servants or apprentices. Bedtime for children was not a gentle routine of stories and lullabies. It was quick and practical. You said your prayers, you lay down, and you hoped you woke up in the morning. Children were also taught from a young age to fear the night. They heard stories of demons, witches, and ghosts. They were warned that bad things happened to children who did not say their prayers, or who misbehaved. Sleep was tied to morality and obedience. There were lullabies, of course, but many of them were surprisingly dark. They spoke of danger, death, and the need for divine protection. These were not soothing songs. They were warnings set to music. Despite all the danger and discomfort, children adapted. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake quickly, and to function on less rest than we would consider healthy today. Childhood in medieval times was short. Responsibility came early, and sleep, like everything else, was just something you endured until you were old enough to endure even more. Let's talk about what happened when people did not wake up. Death in sleep was common, and it shaped how medieval people thought about both sleep and death. Sudden death was terrifying because it meant there was no time to prepare your soul. No confession, no last rites, no chance to make peace with God. If you died in your sleep, your fate in the afterlife was uncertain, and that uncertainty haunted people. This is why evening prayers were so important. Before bed, people prayed not just for protection from demons, but also for a peaceful death if God chose to take them that night. They asked for forgiveness of sins and for mercy on their souls. Some prayers specifically mentioned the fear of dying in sleep. One old prayer goes, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." This prayer, still known today, has medieval roots. When someone did die in their sleep, the family would prepare the body quickly. There was no embalming, no refrigeration. Bodies decomposed fast, especially in warmer months. The deceased would be washed, wrapped in a shroud, and laid out for a brief wake before burial. Burial happened quickly, usually within a day or two. The churchyard was the final resting place for most people, though the wealthy might be buried inside the church itself. There was also a belief in the good death versus the bad death. A good death was one where you had time to confess your sins, receive communion, and say goodbye. A bad death was sudden, violent, or unexpected. Dying in your sleep fell somewhere in between. On one hand, it was peaceful. On the other hand, it was abrupt. Priests would still perform last rites after death if the family called for them. But there was always a lingering question. Was the soul ready? Ghost stories often featured people who had died suddenly and whose spirits could not rest. They returned to haunt the living, seeking prayers or justice, or simply unable to move on. This belief added another layer of fear to sleep. You were not just worried about waking up. You were worried about whether your soul would be ready if you did not. And so, medieval people went to bed every night with prayers on their lips, knowing that sleep and death were separated by the thinnest of veils. Let's shift gears and talk about sleep in medieval hospitals and infirmaries, because even the sick and injured had to sleep somewhere, and it was not comfortable. Medieval hospitals were usually run by monks or nuns and were attached to monasteries or churches. They were places of charity, offering care to pilgrims, the poor, and the sick. But they were not hospitals in the modern sense. Beds were shared. Multiple patients, sometimes strangers, slept side by side in the same bed. Privacy did not exist. If one person had a contagious disease, everyone in the bed was at risk. The beds were simple, wooden frames with straw mattresses. Sheets, if they existed, were rarely changed. Hygiene was minimal. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of unwashed bodies, infection, and death. Patients slept fully clothed because there were no hospital gowns. If you were too sick to undress yourself, you just stayed in whatever you were wearing when you arrived. The care provided was basic. Monks and nuns prayed for the sick, offered water and simple food, and tried to keep patients comfortable, but medical knowledge was limited. Most treatments were more spiritual than practical. Sleep, for the sick, was often fitful and painful. There was no pain medication, no antibiotics, no real treatment for most conditions. You either recovered on your own, or you did not. Many patients never left the hospital alive. Death was a constant presence. Bodies were removed quickly and buried in mass graves near the hospital grounds. For those who did recover, sleep in the hospital was a strange, communal, and often traumatic experience. You were surrounded by suffering, and you slept among strangers who might not be alive in the morning. Yet, these hospitals were acts of mercy. They offered shelter, food, and care to people who had nowhere else to go. Sleep, even in such conditions, was better than dying alone on the street. Now let's talk about the role of sleep in medieval warfare, because soldiers, knights, and mercenaries had some of the most brutal and dangerous sleep experiences imaginable. On campaign, soldiers slept wherever they could. On the ground, in tents if they were lucky, or simply wrapped in their cloaks under the stars. There were no sleeping bags, no cots, no comfort. The ground was cold, hard, and often wet. Soldiers slept in their armor or with their weapons close by because attacks could happen at any moment. A night raid, an ambush, or a surprise assault meant you had to be ready to fight within seconds of waking up. Sleep deprivation was a weapon. Armies would sometimes attack at night, not to win a battle, but to exhaust the enemy. If you could keep the opposing army awake for days, they would be too tired to fight effectively. Guards were posted around camps, taking shifts through the night. Falling asleep on guard duty was a serious offense, punishable by flogging or even execution. Your job was to keep everyone else safe, and if you failed, people died. For knights, sleep before battle was filled with anxiety. They would pray, confess their sins, and try to rest, but fear kept many awake. They knew that the next day might be their last. After a battle, the survivors collapsed from exhaustion. Sleep came hard and fast, but it was not peaceful. Nightmares of the violence they had witnessed or committed haunted them. Medieval soldiers did not have a name for PTSD, but they experienced it. Mercenaries and career soldiers became accustomed to sleeping anywhere, anytime. They learned to sleep lightly, waking at the slightest sound. They slept with one eye open, always alert, always ready. Siege warfare was particularly exhausting. Soldiers might spend months camped outside a castle or city, living in rough conditions, dealing with disease, hunger, and the constant threat of a sortie from the defenders. Inside the besieged castle, defenders faced their own sleep challenges. Limited space, dwindling supplies, and the constant stress of being under attack made rest nearly impossible. Sleep, for medieval warriors, was not rest. It was a brief pause in a life of violence and danger, and it could be interrupted at any moment by the sound of steel and screams. Let's talk about how medieval travelers slept, because if you thought sleeping at home was rough, sleeping on the road was a whole different level of misery. Traveling in medieval times was dangerous, slow, and uncomfortable. Roads were little more than dirt paths, often muddy, rutted, and infested with bandits. Most people traveled on foot or by horse, and a journey of 50 miles could take days. When night fell, travelers had to find shelter. If you were near a town, you might stay at an inn or tavern, but inns were expensive, crowded, and not particularly safe. As we mentioned earlier, you did not get a private room. You paid for a spot in a communal bed, shared with strangers. The bed was crawling with bugs, the blankets were filthy, and your fellow travelers might be thieves, sick, or just unpleasant. Innkeepers had a reputation for being suspicious. Some were honest, but others were known to rob guests in their sleep, or even worse. Travelers slept with their money hidden and their weapons close. If you could not afford an inn, you slept outside. You found a spot off the road, hopefully hidden from view, and wrapped yourself in your cloak. You used your bag as a pillow and hoped you did not get robbed, attacked by animals, or caught in a storm. Forests were particularly dangerous. Wolves, bears, and outlaws all posed threats. Sleeping alone in the woods was a gamble. Some travelers sought shelter in churches or monasteries. Religious houses were expected to offer hospitality, and many did. You might sleep on the floor of a church or in a guest dormitory, but at least you were relatively safe. Pilgrims, traveling to holy sites, often slept in groups for safety. They shared stories, prayers, and body heat. Pilgrimage was a spiritual journey, but it was also a physical ordeal. Merchants, traveling with goods, had to guard their wares constantly. They slept in shifts, always watchful. Losing your cargo meant losing your livelihood. Sleep on the road was short, light, and stressful. You never fully relaxed because danger was always lurking. But travel was necessary, whether for trade, pilgrimage, or war. And so, people endured. Let's talk about sleep and the changing seasons, because medieval sleep was deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. In summer, the days were long and the nights were short. People worked from dawn until dusk, taking advantage of the daylight. Sleep was brief, maybe 5 or 6 hours, and often interrupted by heat and insects. Harvest season was the busiest time of year. Everyone, men, women, children, worked the fields from sunrise to sunset. Sleep was something you squeezed in between exhaustion and the next day's labor. There was no time for rest. Crops had to be brought in before the weather turned. Autumn brought shorter days and cooler nights. Sleep became longer and more comfortable, a brief respite before the hardships of winter. Winter was when sleep patterns changed the most. With daylight lasting only a few hours, people slept more. This was when the segmented sleep pattern was most pronounced. Long winter nights meant more time in bed, but also more time awake in the dark. Spring brought renewal, but also hard work. Planting season meant long days and short nights once again. Sleep was sacrificed for survival. The medieval calendar was filled with religious feast days, and these often disrupted normal sleep patterns. Festivals involved staying up late, drinking, dancing, and celebrating. The next day, everyone was exhausted, but work still had to be done. Lent, the period before Easter, was a time of fasting and penance. People slept less, ate less, and prayed more. It was physically and mentally draining. Medieval people did not fight against the seasons. They accepted that sleep would vary throughout the year. Summer meant less rest. Winter meant more. It was just part of the natural order. This seasonal approach to sleep was actually healthier in some ways. Modern life demands the same sleep schedule year-round, but medieval people adapted to the light, the temperature, and the demands of their environment. Sleep was not a fixed routine. It was fluid, changing with the world around them. Now let's talk about how medieval people tried to improve their sleep, because even though life was hard, humans have always sought comfort. Herbs and plants were used to promote sleep. Chamomile, lavender, and valerian were boiled into teas or stuffed into small pillows. These remedies actually work, and some are still used today. Warm drinks before bed were common. Warm milk, spiced wine, or herbal infusions were believed to help the body relax. Alcohol was also used, though it often led to poor quality sleep and hangovers. Some people believed that eating certain foods could help. Lettuce was thought to have calming properties. Bread soaked in warm milk was a common bedtime snack. For the wealthy, there were more options. Expensive imported spices, incense, and perfumes were used to make bedrooms more pleasant. Some nobles had musicians play soft music to help them fall asleep. Prayer was the most common sleep aid. Bedtime prayers were long, repetitive, and designed to calm the mind. Focusing on the words helped people let go of the day's worries. Routine also helped. Going to bed at the same time, following the same rituals, created a sense of order and predictability. Even in chaos, humans crave structure. Physical exhaustion was perhaps the most effective sleep aid. After a day of hard labor, most people fell asleep quickly, simply because their bodies could not stay awake. But for those who struggled, who lay awake worrying or hurting, sleep remained elusive. There were no magic cures, no quick fixes. You just endured the night and hoped the next one would be better. Medieval people understood that sleep was essential, but they also knew it was often out of their control. So they did what they could, prayed, used herbs, followed routines, and accepted that some nights were just going to be long. Let's talk about medieval beliefs about sleep and the soul, because in a deeply religious world, sleep was more than just physical rest. It was a spiritual state. The church taught that sleep was a gift from God, a time when the body rested and the soul was vulnerable. This vulnerability required protection, which is why prayers before bed were so important. Some theologians believed that during sleep, the soul partially left the body. It roamed, experienced visions, or even traveled to other spiritual realms. This explained dreams, especially vivid or prophetic ones. Good dreams were messages from God or angels. Bad dreams were temptations or attacks from demons. The content of your dreams could reveal the state of your soul. There was also a belief that sleep was a rehearsal for death. Every night, you surrendered consciousness, trusting that you would wake up. This act of surrender was seen as an exercise in faith. Some saints were said to need very little sleep because they were so filled with divine grace. Stories of holy men and women who stayed awake for days, sustained only by prayer, were told as examples of spiritual strength. On the flip side, excessive sleep was seen as laziness, one of the 7 deadly sins. Sleeping too much meant you were indulging the flesh and neglecting your spiritual duties. The medieval church even had specific prayers for different times of night. Compline, the final prayer of the day, was designed to prepare the soul for sleep. It included prayers for protection, forgiveness, and a peaceful rest. Monks chanted psalms before bed, asking God to guard them through the night. The words were meant to comfort and remind them that even in sleep, they were not alone. There was also a belief in guardian angels. Everyone had one, and part of their job was to watch over you while you slept. This belief provided comfort in a world full of dangers. So sleep, in the medieval mind, was not just a biological function. It was a spiritual journey, a test of faith, and a nightly reminder of human frailty and divine grace. Let's talk about how medieval sleep habits compare to modern ones, because the differences are striking. Medieval people slept more in total hours, but less in one continuous block. They averaged around 8 to 9 hours, but it was broken up. We averaged 7 to 8 hours, but we try to do it all at once. They went to bed earlier, usually shortly after sunset. We stay up late, often past midnight, thanks to artificial light and screens. They woke up naturally, guided by light and routine. We wake up to alarms, often jarring ourselves out of deep sleep. Their sleep environment was cold, dark, and uncomfortable. Ours is climate-controlled, cushioned, and designed for comfort. They shared beds and space. We value privacy and personal space. They accepted waking up in the middle of the night. We see it as a problem that needs fixing. They lived with constant discomfort, bugs, pain, cold. We have medications, mattresses, and technology to eliminate most of those issues. They saw sleep as a spiritual and communal act. We see it as a personal, private, and often solitary experience. But here's the interesting part. Some researchers believe that the segmented sleep pattern of medieval times might actually be more natural than our modern 8-hour block. Humans might be wired to wake up in the middle of the night, and forcing ourselves to sleep straight through could be causing problems. Studies have shown that when people are deprived of artificial light for extended periods, they naturally fall into a segmented sleep pattern. First sleep, a wakeful period, then second sleep, just like medieval people. This suggests that our modern sleep culture, while more comfortable, might not be entirely in sync with our biology. Medieval people also had less sleep anxiety. They did not stress about getting exactly 8 hours or falling asleep within 15 minutes. Sleep was just something that happened, sometimes good, sometimes bad. We track our sleep with apps, worry about sleep quality, and treat insomnia as a medical crisis. They just accepted that some nights were rough and moved on. Of course, we have it better overall. Our beds are cleaner, safer, and more comfortable. We do not share them with livestock or strangers. We have heat, light, and medicine. But maybe, just maybe, we could learn something from medieval sleep culture. Acceptance of natural waking, less anxiety about perfect sleep, and a recognition that rest is more important than rigid schedules. Sleep has always been essential, but how we sleep and how we think about sleep has changed dramatically, and both approaches have their strengths and weaknesses. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in your quiet room, with your thermostat set just right, maybe take a moment to appreciate how far we have come, and maybe, if you wake up in the middle of the night, do not panic. Do not reach for your phone. Just lie there in the darkness. And remember that for most of human history, this was normal. You are not broken. You are just human. And sleep, like life, has always been a little bit strange, a little bit uncomfortable, and a lot more complicated than it seems. Now let's talk about medieval sleep and pregnancy, because if you think sleep is hard normally, try doing it while carrying a baby in a world with no prenatal care, no comfortable maternity pillows, and definitely no epidurals. Pregnant women in medieval times faced unique challenges when it came to sleep. As their bellies grew, finding a comfortable sleeping position became increasingly difficult. Remember, they were sleeping on straw mattresses that offered no support, no contouring, nothing that adapted to a changing body. Medical texts from the period offered advice, some helpful, some bizarre. Physicians recommended that pregnant women sleep on their left side, which is actually good advice that doctors still give today. But they also suggested all sorts of strange things, like avoiding sleeping on your back because it would make the baby lazy, or not sleeping on your stomach because you would crush the child. The fear of miscarriage was constant. Women were told to avoid sudden movements, loud noises, and frightening dreams, all of which were believed to cause the baby to be lost. If a woman had a nightmare, she would worry that it was an omen of something going wrong with the pregnancy. Sleep during pregnancy was often disrupted by physical discomfort. Back pain, the need to urinate frequently, and the baby moving were all issues then just as they are now. But medieval women had no pain relief, no pregnancy pillows to support their bodies, and no way to adjust the temperature of their room for comfort. There was also the fear of what would happen during labor. Many women did not survive childbirth, and they knew it. This anxiety made sleep in the final weeks of pregnancy especially difficult. Every night could potentially be one of the last peaceful nights before the ordeal of labor began. After the baby was born, sleep became even more fragmented. Newborns needed to be fed constantly, and there was no such thing as formula or pumped milk. The mother had to be available to nurse around the clock. In a one-room house with multiple family members, privacy for feeding was non-existent. Postpartum recovery was brutal. Women were expected to return to work quickly, often within days of giving birth. There was no maternity leave, no time to rest and heal. Sleep deprivation was just another burden to carry. Some women died from infections or complications after childbirth, often while trying to rest and recover. The phrase, childbed fever, was whispered in fear, knowing that it claimed many new mothers. For those who survived, the exhaustion of caring for a newborn while managing a household, working in the fields, and dealing with other children was overwhelming. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. Medieval motherhood was an act of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. And sleep, during and after pregnancy, was just one more thing that had to be endured with grace, strength, and very little support. Let's shift to something fascinating. Medieval beliefs about sleep positions and what they supposedly revealed about your character, health, and even your morality. Medieval physicians and theologians paid surprising attention to how people slept. Your sleeping position was thought to reflect your inner nature, your health, and your relationship with God. Sleeping on your back was generally frowned upon. It was considered the position of the prideful and the lazy. It left you exposed and vulnerable, and some believed it invited demons to sit on your chest. This position was also associated with gluttony, because it was how people slept after overeating. Sleeping on your stomach was seen as immodest and potentially sinful. It was thought to provoke lustful dreams and inappropriate thoughts. The church discouraged this position, especially for young people and those trying to live virtuously. The preferred position was sleeping on your right side, curled slightly. This was considered the most natural, the most pious, and the healthiest. It was believed to aid digestion, keep the heart safe, and promote good dreams. Sleeping on your left side was acceptable, but less ideal. Some medical texts claimed it put pressure on the heart and could lead to nightmares or disturbed sleep. There were also beliefs about how your arms and legs should be positioned. Sleeping with your arms crossed over your chest was considered bad luck because it resembled a corpse laid out for burial. It was thought to invite death or bad omens. Sleeping with your knees drawn up was seen as a sign of humility and was encouraged. Sprawling out with limbs extended was considered arrogant and disrespectful, especially in shared beds where space was limited. Interestingly, some of these beliefs have roots in actual physiology. Sleeping on your right side does aid digestion. Sleeping on your back can worsen snoring and sleep apnea. Medieval people observed these effects and created explanations based on their understanding of the world. But they also layered in morality and spirituality. Every physical act had a spiritual dimension, and sleep was no exception. How you positioned your body at night was seen as a reflection of how you positioned your soul in life. Monks were particularly strict about sleep positions. Some monastic rules specified exactly how monks should sleep, with hands folded, bodies straight, and faces turned upward in a posture of surrender to God. For the average person, these rules were more like guidelines. You slept however you could manage on your lumpy straw mattress, surrounded by family and livestock. But the belief that your sleeping position mattered lingered in the cultural consciousness. Even today, we have ideas about what different sleeping positions say about personality. The medieval world simply took it further, connecting physical posture to moral character and spiritual health. Now let's talk about medieval sleep and mental health. Because while they did not have the language we use today, they absolutely recognized that sleep and emotional well-being were connected. Depression, anxiety, and what we now call mental illness were understood differently in medieval times. They were often attributed to demonic possession, imbalanced humors, or spiritual struggles. But the symptoms, including sleep disturbances, were observed and documented. People who could not sleep were thought to be tormented by guilt, sin, or evil spirits. Excessive sleep, on the other hand, was seen as a sign of melancholy, one of the 4 humoral imbalances. Melancholy was associated with black bile and was believed to cause sadness, lethargy, and a desire to withdraw from the world. Medieval physicians prescribed various treatments for sleep problems related to melancholy. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary changes, and even music therapy were used. Some treatments were surprisingly effective. Music, for instance, has been shown to help with sleep and mood. Religious figures offered spiritual remedies. Prayer, confession, penance, and pilgrimage were all recommended for those struggling with troubled sleep and dark thoughts. The belief was that aligning yourself with God would bring peace to your mind and rest to your body. There are medieval accounts of people who suffered from what we would now recognize as insomnia, nightmares, and sleep disturbances related to trauma or stress. Soldiers returning from war, people who had witnessed violence, and those who had lost loved ones, all experienced sleep problems. But there was no therapy, no medication, and very little understanding of the psychological roots of these issues. People suffered in silence, or they sought help from priests, healers, and folk remedies. Some turned to alcohol or herbal sedatives, which provided temporary relief but often made things worse in the long run. Addiction was not understood as a disease, but people recognized that some individuals became dependent on certain substances. Seasonal affective disorder, though not named, was likely experienced by many. The long, dark winters, combined with poor nutrition and isolation, would have taken a toll on mental health. People slept more in winter, partly because there was less daylight, but also because depression and low energy made it hard to do anything else. Women, in particular, were thought to be prone to emotional disturbances related to their wandering womb, a ridiculous medieval theory that blamed all female health problems on the uterus moving around the body. Sleep problems in women were often dismissed or attributed to hysteria. Despite the limited understanding, medieval people knew that sleep mattered. They observed that people who slept well were healthier and happier. They noticed that lack of sleep made people irritable, confused, and weak. They did not have the science, but they had the human experience. And that experience told them that sleep was essential, not just for the body, but for the mind and soul as well. Let's talk about medieval sleep and the elderly, because aging in the Middle Ages was hard, and sleep became even more difficult as the body wore down. Most people did not live to old age. If you made it past 50, you were considered ancient. But for those who did survive, sleep became a precious and elusive thing. Arthritis, a constant companion of the elderly, made lying down painful. The hard, lumpy straw mattresses offered no relief. Every position hurt. Rolling over was an ordeal. Getting up in the morning required help from family members. Chronic pain was just part of aging. There were no painkillers beyond willow bark tea, which contains a compound similar to aspirin or alcohol, which dulled the senses but did not truly address the pain. Respiratory problems were common. Sleeping in smoky, poorly ventilated homes for decades took a toll on the lungs. Coughing fits would wake people up at night, leaving them gasping for air. The elderly were also more vulnerable to the cold. Their bodies could not regulate temperature as well, and they felt every draft, every drop in temperature. They huddled close to the fire, wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned, and still shivered through the night. Incontinence was another issue, though it was rarely discussed. Elderly people who could not control their bladders faced humiliation and discomfort. There were no adult diapers, no waterproof mattress covers. Straw mattresses soaked up urine and became foul. Sleep patterns changed with age. The elderly woke up more frequently, slept more lightly, and often could not fall back asleep once awake. This was seen as natural, a sign that the body was preparing for the final sleep of death. There was a certain fatalism about aging. People accepted that growing old meant growing weaker, sicker, and more tired. Sleep was no longer restful. It was just a way to pass the time until the end came. But the elderly were also valued in some ways. They held knowledge, experience, and family history. Grandparents told stories, offered advice, and helped care for children. Their difficulty sleeping was tolerated because they still contributed to the household. Some elderly people were cared for lovingly by their families. Others were seen as burdens, extra mouths to feed who contributed little. How you were treated in old age depended largely on your family, your status, and whether you still had resources to offer. Death, for the elderly, was often a relief. After years of pain, cold, and sleepless nights, the final rest was welcomed. Families prayed that their aging relatives would pass peacefully in their sleep, sparing everyone the drawn-out suffering of a prolonged illness. Medieval old age was not a golden time of retirement and leisure. It was a slow, uncomfortable decline, and sleep, which should have been a comfort, became just another source of difficulty. Now let's talk about medieval sleep and animals, because humans were not the only ones dealing with sleep challenges in the Middle Ages. As we have discussed, livestock often slept indoors with families during winter, but animals have their own sleep patterns, and sharing a space with them meant dealing with their nighttime behaviors. Cows, for instance, sleep lying down, but also doze while standing. They are light sleepers, easily startled. A cow shifting in the middle of the night could wake the entire household. And when a cow decided to relieve itself, well, everyone knew about it immediately. Goats are mischievous and curious. They do not sleep deeply and are prone to wandering around at night, chewing on things they should not, and generally causing low-level chaos. Sleeping near a goat meant never fully relaxing. Pigs snore, loudly, and they root around, grunting and snuffling, searching for food or just being pigs. They are also surprisingly strong and could knock things over or push people out of the way. Chickens roost at night and are generally quiet, but they wake up at the first hint of dawn and immediately start making noise. If you wanted to sleep past sunrise, tough luck. The chickens had other plans. Dogs, which were common in medieval households, were working animals. They guarded homes and flocks, hunted, and helped with herding. At night, dogs barked at every sound. A fox in the distance, a stranger on the road, a branch falling from a tree. Anything would set them off. Cats were valued for controlling rodents, but they were also nocturnal hunters. They prowled at night, climbed on things, knocked objects over, and occasionally brought dead mice into the house as gifts. Sleeping through a cat's nighttime activities required serious willpower. Rats and mice were constant problems. They lived in the walls, in the thatch, under the floorboards. At night, they came out to scavenge. The sound of tiny feet scurrying, teeth gnawing, and the occasional squeak were part of the soundtrack of medieval sleep. Larger animals, like horses and oxen, were usually kept in separate buildings or stalls, but even they made noise. Horses whinny, stomp, and shift around. Oxen low and chew cud loudly. If your home was attached to a barn, you heard everything. And then there were the wild animals. Wolves howled in the distance, a sound that sent chills down the spine and reminded everyone that danger was just beyond the door. Owls hooted, foxes screamed, and deer sometimes crashed through underbrush, startling people awake. Medieval people learned to sleep through animal noises, or at least to sleep lightly enough that they could respond if something was truly wrong. But the constant presence of animals, both domestic and wild, meant that silence was rare. In a strange way, the animals provided comfort. Their sounds were familiar, part of the rhythm of life. A household without animal noises would have felt empty and wrong. Sleep in the medieval world was never a solitary experience. You shared it with family, with neighbors, with livestock, and with the entire natural world just outside your walls. Let's talk about medieval sleep and the weather, because storms, rain, and harsh conditions did not just affect the day. They made nights miserable too. Rainstorms were particularly challenging. Thatched roofs, while effective when new, deteriorated over time. After a few seasons, they leaked. When it rained, water dripped through the roof into the house. You could place buckets to catch the drips, but there were always more leaks than containers. Beds got wet. Blankets soaked through. The dirt floor turned to mud. Sleep was impossible when you were lying in a puddle. Thunder and lightning terrified medieval people. They did not understand electricity or atmospheric pressure. Thunder was thought to be the voice of God or the sound of demons fighting in the sky. Lightning was a divine weapon or a curse. When storms hit at night, people huddled together praying for protection. Some believed that ringing church bells would drive away the storm. Others made the sign of the cross and hoped for the best. Hailstorms were particularly feared. Large hail could damage crops, kill livestock, and even injure people. The sound of hail pounding on the roof was deafening and unsettling. Sleep was out of the question until the storm passed. Winter storms brought snow, ice, and bone-chilling cold. Snow could pile up against the walls, blocking doors and windows. The cold seeped through every crack, making the house feel like a freezer. Blizzards were deadly. If you were caught outside or if your home was not secure, you could freeze to death. People went to bed during winter storms, not knowing if they would wake up, or if they did, whether they would be able to dig themselves out. Flooding was another danger. Homes built near rivers or in low-lying areas were at risk. When floods came, they came fast. People could wake up to find water rising inside their homes, forcing them to flee with whatever they could carry. Earthquakes, though less common, were also terrifying. Medieval people had no understanding of tectonic plates. They saw earthquakes as punishment from God, or signs of the apocalypse. The ground shaking while you tried to sleep was an experience that left people traumatized. Even on calm nights, the weather was a presence. Wind rattled shutters, whistled through cracks, and carried sounds from far away. A cold night made you burrow deeper into your blankets. A hot night made you throw them off and lie there sweating. Medieval people were at the mercy of the weather. They could not control it, predict it accurately, or protect themselves from it fully. Sleep happened in spite of the weather, not because conditions were ideal. And yet, they adapted. They learned to sleep through storms, to wake up when the wind shifted, to read the signs of changing weather even in their sleep. Survival required being attuned to the natural world, even at night. Now let's explore medieval sleep and superstitions, because the night was filled with magical thinking, folk beliefs, and rituals designed to protect sleepers from harm. One common belief was that you should never sleep with your feet pointing toward the door. This was considered bad luck because that was the position of a corpse being carried out of the house. Sleeping that way was thought to invite death. Another superstition involved mirrors. Some people believed that mirrors should be covered at night because they could trap your soul while you slept or become portals for spirits to enter the room. There were beliefs about what you should and should not do before bed. Cutting your nails at night was considered dangerous. Whistling after dark would attract evil spirits. Counting stars would give you warts. Certain objects were thought to protect you while you slept. Iron, as mentioned, repelled fairies and demons. A horseshoe hung above the bed brought good luck. Garlic, not just for vampires in later folklore, was believed to ward off evil. Some people placed a broom by the door, believing that witches would be compelled to count every straw before entering, and by the time they finished, dawn would come, and they would have to leave. Salt, that precious commodity, was also a protective charm. A line of salt across the threshold kept evil out. A pinch of salt under the pillow prevented nightmares. There were also beliefs about animals and sleep. If a dog howled at night, it meant death was near. If a cat slept on your chest, it would steal your breath. If birds flew into the house at night, it was an omen of disaster. Dreams of certain things had specific meanings. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant someone in your family would die. Dreaming of clear water was good. Dreaming of muddy water was bad. Dreaming of bread meant prosperity. Dreaming of fire meant passion or anger. Some people kept dream journals, not in the modern therapeutic sense, but to record prophecies and warnings. Dreams were taken seriously, and a particularly vivid dream could change someone's plans for the day. There were rituals to ensure good dreams. Eating certain foods, saying specific prayers, or placing herbs like mugwort under your pillow were all believed to bring pleasant visions. On the other hand, there were also curses and hexes related to sleep. A witch could supposedly curse someone to never sleep soundly again. A jilted lover might place a charm to give their ex nightmares. These beliefs were real and powerful in the medieval mind. Sleep, in this world, was not just a physical state. It was a spiritual battleground, a time of vulnerability, and an opportunity for magic, both good and bad. Let's talk about medieval sleep and death omens, because the line between sleep and death was thin, and people were always watching for signs. If someone slept too deeply, so deeply they could not be easily woken, it was seen as a bad sign. People feared that the person was slipping away, that their soul was already beginning to detach from their body. Snoring, as mentioned earlier, was actually reassuring because it meant the person was definitely alive. Silence, especially a sudden silence after someone had been breathing loudly, would cause panic. There were specific omens related to sleep that predicted death. If you dreamed of a dead relative calling your name, it was believed they were coming to take you with them. If you dreamed of your own funeral, death was close. Some believed that if a healthy person suddenly started sleeping more than usual, it was a sign that death was approaching. The body was preparing to shut down, and sleep was the first step. Unusual sleep behaviors were also seen as omens. If someone who normally slept well suddenly could not sleep, it might mean they were being visited by the spirits of the soon-to-be dead. If they cried out in their sleep, It was believed they were fighting off death itself. There were also signs in the physical world. If a candle flickered and went out while someone slept, it could mean their life was being extinguished. If an owl called 3 times outside a window, death would come to that house within 3 days. These beliefs were not just superstition. They were ways of making sense of a world where death was common, sudden, and often inexplicable. By watching for omens, people felt they had some control, some warning, even if they could not prevent what was coming. When someone did die, there were rituals around their final sleep. The body was never left alone. Someone always sat with it, watching, praying, making sure the soul had safely departed and that no evil spirits tried to possess the corpse. The wake, still practiced in many cultures today, comes from this tradition. To wake the dead was to watch over them, to keep vigil, to ensure that if they were not truly dead, someone would notice before burial. Mirrors were covered, clocks were stopped, and sometimes windows were opened to let the soul escape. All of these rituals were rooted in beliefs about the relationship between sleep, death, and the soul. Medieval people lived with death constantly. It was not hidden in hospitals or funeral homes. It was part of daily life. And so, sleep, which so closely resembled death, was both necessary and frightening. Every night, you surrendered to sleep, not knowing if you would wake. And every morning that you did wake was a small victory, a reprieve, a gift. Let's talk about medieval sleep and alcohol, because in a world where water was unsafe and stress was high, drinking played a significant role in how people slept. As we mentioned earlier, most people drank beer or ale throughout the day. These were weak, small beers with low alcohol content, safer than water and providing some nutrition. But there was also stronger alcohol consumed, especially in the evening. Wine, mead, and stronger ales were common. Nobles drank more wine, peasants drank more ale and mead. These drinks were not just for celebration. They were part of daily life, a way to relax after a hard day's work. Many people drank before bed. The belief was that a warm drink helped you sleep. Spiced wine, heated and mixed with honey and herbs, was a popular nightcap. It warmed the body, dulled pain, and made it easier to drift off, despite the discomfort of a straw mattress. But alcohol, as we know today, does not actually improve sleep quality. It might help you fall asleep faster, but it disrupts the deeper stages of sleep and can cause you to wake up more often during the night. Medieval people likely experienced this but had no way to understand it. They just knew that sometimes, despite drinking, sleep was still restless. They blamed it on demons, bad humors, or the position of the moon. Alcoholism existed in medieval times, though it was not called that. Some people drank too much, too often, and it affected their health, their work, and their families. But there was little help available. Drinking was seen as a personal failing, a sin, not a disease. Monasteries brewed their own beer and wine, and monks were known to drink. In fact, beer was sometimes called liquid bread because it was so filling and nutritious. But there were also rules about moderation, and monks who drank to excess could be punished. Taverns and inns were places where people went to drink, socialize, and often to sleep. After a night of drinking, travelers would stumble to a communal bed and pass out, waking up hours later with a headache and regrets. Hangovers were common, and there were folk remedies for them. Raw eggs, herbal teas, and more alcohol, the hair of the dog cure, were all used. None of them worked particularly well. Alcohol was also used as a painkiller and sedative in medical settings. Before a surgery or painful procedure, patients were given strong wine or spirits to dull the pain. It was not effective, but it was all they had. For many people, alcohol was the only relief from the pain and hardship of daily life. It helped them sleep, at least fitfully, and face another day. But it was a double-edged sword, offering comfort while also causing harm. Medieval sleep for many was a haze of exhaustion, discomfort, and alcohol-induced unconsciousness. Not restful, not peaceful, but sufficient to keep going. Let's talk about medieval sleep and crime, because the cover of darkness brought out dangers that made sleep even more precarious. Nighttime was when criminals operated. With no streetlights, no police patrols, and most people asleep, thieves had the perfect opportunity to strike. Breaking into homes, stealing livestock, or robbing travelers on the road were all common nighttime activities. Medieval towns and cities had curfews. When the church bell rang, usually around sunset, everyone was expected to be indoors. The gates were closed, and being out after curfew could get you arrested or worse. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, carrying lanterns and calling out the hours. Their job was to watch for fires, criminals, and anything suspicious. But they were few in number, and the darkness was vast. In rural areas, there were no watchmen at all. Families had to protect themselves. Doors were barred with heavy wooden beams. Shutters were locked tight. Dogs were kept not just for work, but as alarms. A barking dog could wake the household and scare off intruders. But even locked doors were not always enough. Determined thieves could break through wattle and daub walls, pry open shutters, or simply wait for everyone to fall asleep and then sneak in. Valuable items, what few peasants had, were hidden. Money, if any, was buried or sewn into clothing. Tools, weapons, and even food had to be secured because hungry neighbors or passing vagrants might help themselves. Sleeping soundly was dangerous. You had to sleep lightly, alert to any unusual sounds. A creak, a whisper, the sound of a door being tested. Any of these could mean trouble. In towns, inns and taverns were particularly risky. You shared a room with strangers, and while you slept, your belongings could disappear. Innkeepers had a reputation, sometimes deserved, for being in league with thieves. You paid for a bed and woke up robbed. Travelers sleeping outdoors were even more vulnerable. Bandits roamed the roads, looking for lone individuals or small groups. Falling asleep in the wrong place could cost you everything, including your life. There were also stories, some true, some exaggerated, of entire villages being attacked at night. Raiders, outlaws, or enemy soldiers would descend in the darkness, burning, looting, and killing. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon. For women, nighttime brought additional dangers. Assault was a real threat, and the darkness made it easier for predators to operate. Women traveling alone or sleeping in vulnerable places were at risk. Medieval justice was harsh, but it was not always effective. If you were robbed, there was no guarantee the thief would be caught. If you were attacked, you might never see justice. Self-protection was the only reliable option. So sleep, in medieval times, was not just about rest. It was about vigilance. You closed your eyes, but part of your mind stayed awake, listening, ready to respond to danger. Now let's talk about medieval sleep and religious visions, because for some people, sleep was not just a time of rest, but a gateway to the divine. Throughout the Middle Ages, there are accounts of saints, mystics, and ordinary believers experiencing visions during sleep. These were not ordinary dreams. They were believed to be direct communications from God, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. Religious visions often came during what we would now recognize as sleep paralysis, or hypnagogic states, the transitional moments between waking and sleeping. The person would see figures of light, hear voices, or experience overwhelming emotions of peace or terror. For someone in medieval times, especially someone deeply religious, these experiences were not hallucinations. They were real, tangible encounters with the divine, and they were treated with immense seriousness. If a monk reported a vision, it might be investigated by church authorities. Was it genuine? Was it a test from God? Or was it a trick of the devil? The content of the vision, the character of the person, and the context all mattered. Some visions led to major decisions. A saint might receive instructions to found a monastery, go on a pilgrimage, or deliver a message to a king. These visions could change the course of history. One famous example is Joan of Arc, who claimed to hear voices and see visions of saints telling her to lead France in battle. Whether you believe her visions were divine, psychological, or something else, they were real to her and to those who followed her. Ordinary people also experienced what they believed were religious visions during sleep. A farmer might dream of the Virgin Mary warning him of danger. A mother might see her deceased child in heaven. These dreams provided comfort, guidance, and hope. But there was also fear. Not all nighttime visions were holy. Some people reported seeing demons, hell, or tormented souls. These visions were terrifying and were often interpreted as warnings to repent. The church taught that God could use sleep and dreams to communicate with his people, but it also warned that the devil was a deceiver who could appear as an angel of light. Discernment was crucial. Prayer before sleep was partly meant to invite good visions and ward off bad ones. By placing yourself in God's hands, you hoped that your sleep would be protected and that any visions you received would be trustworthy. There were also pilgrimage sites where people went specifically to receive healing dreams. They would sleep in a church or at a saint's shrine, hoping for a vision that would cure their illness or answer their prayers. This practice, called incubation, was an ancient tradition that continued into the medieval period. Sleep, in the religious imagination, was not passive. It was an active state where the soul was open, vulnerable, and receptive. What happened during sleep could be as important, or more important, than what happened during waking hours. Let's talk about medieval sleep and the phases of the moon, because lunar cycles were believed to have a powerful effect on sleep, health, and behavior. Medieval people observed that the moon influenced many things: tides, menstrual cycles, the growth of crops. It made sense to them that it would also affect sleep. Sleeping during a full moon was thought to be dangerous. The light itself was believed to have strange effects. Some said it could drive people mad, which is where we get the word lunatic from luna, meaning moon. There were beliefs that sleeping in direct moonlight could cause illness, bad dreams, or even temporary insanity. People closed shutters tightly on full moon nights, not just to block out the light, but to protect themselves from its supposed harmful influence. The full moon was also associated with increased activity from supernatural beings. Werewolves, witches, and restless spirits were all thought to be more active when the moon was full. Sleep on those nights was lighter, more anxious. On the other hand, the new moon was considered a good time for rest and renewal. The darkness of a moonless night was deep and complete, and people believed it was a time when the body could truly relax and heal. Medieval astrology taught that the moon governed sleep and dreams. Your birth chart could reveal whether you were a good sleeper or a restless one, based on the position of the moon at the time of your birth. Physicians sometimes consulted lunar calendars when prescribing treatments. Bloodletting, for instance, was thought to be more effective at certain phases of the moon. Similarly, sleep remedies might be recommended based on the lunar cycle. Farmers and laborers planned their work around the moon as well. Planting, harvesting, and animal husbandry were all influenced by lunar phases, and this in turn affected sleep patterns. During busy phases, like planting or harvest, sleep was sacrificed. During quieter times, rest was more plentiful. Interestingly, modern science has found that there may be some truth to lunar effects on sleep. Studies have shown that people sometimes sleep less well during a full moon, possibly because of increased light or because of evolutionary patterns. Medieval people did not understand the science, but they were keen observers. They noticed patterns and built their beliefs around them. Whether those beliefs were accurate or not, they shaped how people experienced and talked about sleep. The moon was a constant presence in medieval life. It governed the calendar, guided travelers at night, and inspired poetry and song. And it was always there, watching over sleepers, for better or worse. Let's talk about medieval sleep and fasting, because religious fasting practices had a profound effect on how people slept. The medieval Christian calendar was full of fast days. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was the most intense. But there were also weekly fast days, usually Wednesdays and Fridays, and various other periods of fasting throughout the year. Fasting meant eating less, eating later in the day, or abstaining from certain foods, especially meat, dairy, and eggs. For people who were already on the edge of malnutrition, fasting was physically demanding. Hunger affects sleep. Going to bed hungry makes it harder to fall asleep and easier to wake up during the night. Medieval people fasting for religious reasons would have experienced this regularly. There are accounts of monks struggling to sleep during Lent because their bodies were weak from fasting. They were expected to maintain their full schedule of prayers and work, but their energy was depleted. Some monks and mystics practiced extreme fasting as a form of devotion. They ate only bread and water, or even less. This led to severe malnutrition, visions, hallucinations, and disturbed sleep. Some historians believe that many of the religious visions reported during the Middle Ages were actually the result of fasting-induced altered states. Hunger, combined with sleep deprivation and intense prayer, could produce powerful psychological experiences. For ordinary people, fasting was less extreme but still significant. A peasant family during Lent might have very little to eat. Porridge, bread, vegetables, no meat, no cheese, no eggs. The body craved calories and nutrients, and sleep suffered as a result. Children, the elderly, and pregnant women were sometimes exempt from fasting, but not always. And even when they were exempt, limited food supplies meant they often went hungry anyway. There was also the belief that fasting purified the soul and brought you closer to God. Suffering was redemptive. Going to bed hungry was an offering, a sacrifice that demonstrated faith and discipline. Some people took this too far. Fasting could become obsessive, an early form of what we might now recognize as eating disorders. The church both encouraged fasting and warned against excess, but the line was not always clear. After a fast ended, usually with a feast day, the relief was enormous. Bodies starved for weeks suddenly received rich foods. This could lead to overeating, stomach problems, and, ironically, poor sleep from indigestion. Medieval life was a cycle of deprivation and occasional abundance, and sleep, which should have been a refuge, was caught in that cycle, disrupted by hunger, shaped by faith, and tested by endurance. Now let's talk about medieval sleep and illness, because when you were sick, sleep became both more necessary and more difficult. Getting sick in medieval times was terrifying. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs. Illness could come suddenly, and it could kill you just as quickly. When someone fell ill, they were often isolated. Contagious diseases were recognized, even if the mechanisms were not understood. The sick person would be placed in a corner of the house, or in a separate space, to prevent spreading the illness. But isolation did not mean comfort. They still slept on straw, covered with rough blankets, with little more than prayers and folk remedies to help them. Fever was common and made sleep almost impossible. The body burned, the skin was hot and dry, and delirium set in. People thrashed, called out, and experienced terrifying hallucinations. Family members stayed nearby, trying to cool the fever with wet cloths and murmured prayers. Coughing fits, especially from respiratory illnesses, woke people constantly. There was no cough syrup, no vapor rubs. Honey, if available, might soothe the throat, but it did not stop the coughing. Pain was constant. Toothaches, headaches, stomach aches, joint pain. There was no Tylenol, no Advil. Willow bark tea, alcohol, and opium-based remedies were used, but they were not always effective or available. Vomiting and diarrhea, common with many illnesses, made rest impossible. You could not sleep when your body was constantly expelling fluids. Dehydration set in quickly, and without intravenous fluids, recovery was uncertain. The plague, when it struck, was the worst. People developed painful swellings, high fevers, and in many cases, gangrene. Sleep was a torment. Many died within days, sometimes within hours. Quarantine measures were attempted. Entire households were sealed in their homes, marked with a cross to warn others. Inside, the sick and the healthy were trapped together, and sleep became a desperate, fearful thing. Mental illness, which we now understand better, was also present. People with what we would call depression, anxiety, or psychosis struggled with sleep. They were often treated with prayer, exorcism, or confinement, none of which helped. Epilepsy, which caused seizures, was particularly frightening. Seizures could happen during sleep, and people believed they were being attacked by demons. The person would wake up confused, injured, and terrified. Chronic conditions, like arthritis, gout, or digestive problems, made sleep a nightly ordeal. There was no managing these conditions long term. You just suffered through. Caregivers, usually women, stayed up through the night nursing the sick. They got little sleep themselves, running on exhaustion and duty. When someone recovered, it was seen as a miracle. God had spared them. When someone died, it was God's will. Either way, sleep during illness was a trial, a test of endurance, and often the last rest before the final one. Let's talk about medieval sleep and pilgrimage, because traveling for religious reasons meant sleeping in strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous places. Pilgrimage was a major part of medieval religious life. People traveled to holy sites, shrines of saints, or places where miracles had occurred. These journeys could be short, just a day or two, or they could take months, or even years. Pilgrims walked. Most could not afford horses. They carried what they needed on their backs: a cloak, a water skin, a small amount of food, and their faith. At night, they sought shelter wherever they could. Some towns and monasteries had hospices, places specifically for pilgrims to sleep. These were basic, usually just a large room with straw on the floor, but they were safe and free. If no hospice was available, pilgrims slept outside, under trees, in fields, by the roadside. They wrapped themselves in their cloaks and hoped for good weather. Groups of pilgrims often traveled together for safety. At night, they would camp together, share a fire, and take turns keeping watch. Sleep was light because danger was always a possibility. Bandits targeted pilgrims. They knew pilgrims carried money for offerings, and they were often unarmed and vulnerable. An attack in the night could leave pilgrims robbed, injured, or dead. Weather was another challenge. Rain, cold, heat, all made sleeping outdoors miserable. Pilgrims endured because the journey was an act of penance, a demonstration of devotion. Some pilgrimage sites, like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, were major destinations. The routes were well established, and there were more places to stay. But even so, accommodations were crowded, dirty, and uncomfortable. Pilgrims shared spaces with strangers, slept in their clothes, and woke up sore and exhausted. But they kept going because the goal was sacred. The act of pilgrimage was itself a form of suffering, and sleep deprivation was part of that. Arriving at the shrine exhausted, footsore, and weary was part of the experience. It was a sacrifice offered to God or the saint. Some pilgrims went barefoot, adding to their suffering. Others wore chains or carried heavy crosses. Sleep, already difficult, became even more so. At the end of the journey, pilgrims would pray at the shrine, make an offering, and sometimes experience a vision or healing. Then they had to make the journey home, often just as difficult as the journey there. Pilgrimage sleep was not about rest. It was about endurance, about pushing the body to its limits in service of the soul. Finally, let's talk about medieval sleep and storytelling, because before bed, when families gathered, stories were told, and these stories shaped dreams and imaginations. Storytelling was one of the few forms of entertainment available. After the day's work, when the fire was banked and darkness settled, families would sit together and share stories. These were not written down. They were passed orally, from generation to generation. Fairy tales, legends, heroic sagas, ghost stories, and moral fables all filled the long winter nights. Children listened, wide-eyed, as grandparents told tales of knights and dragons, of saints and miracles, of clever peasants outsmarting nobles. These stories entertained, but they also taught values, warned of dangers, and connected the present to the past. Some stories were scary, meant to keep children from wandering at night or misbehaving. Tales of creatures that snatched disobedient children, or ghosts that haunted those who sinned, were common. Other stories were hopeful, about poor people who found treasure, or about kind acts rewarded by saints. These gave comfort and encouraged good behavior. The stories also prepared children for sleep. The rhythm of the tale, the familiar patterns, the soothing voice of the storyteller, all helped ease the transition from wakefulness to rest. Adults told stories too, to each other. Older tales, histories of the village, accounts of strange events, gossip wrapped in narrative. These stories bonded communities and kept memories alive. Some stories were bawdy, full of humor and innuendo, told when children were asleep. Medieval people had an earthy sense of humor, and storytelling was one of the few outlets for it. Traveling storytellers, minstrels, and bards also brought new stories. They moved from village to village, performing in exchange for food and shelter. Their tales were more elaborate, sometimes accompanied by music or gestures. These performances could go late into the night, and listeners would stay awake, entranced, even though they had to wake early the next day. Stories shaped dreams. After hearing a tale of a saint's vision, you might dream of angels. After a ghost story, your sleep might be troubled by shadows and whispers. The boundary between story and reality was thin. People believed in the creatures and events described in their tales. A story about a witch was not just fiction. It was a warning about something that could really happen. So storytelling was not just entertainment. It was education, bonding, and a way to make sense of the world. And when the story ended, you lay down to sleep with images in your mind, and those images followed you into dreams. Medieval sleep, as we have seen, was complex, challenging, and deeply woven into every aspect of life. It was not separate from work, from faith, from community. It was part of the rhythm of existence, shaped by light and dark, by season and weather, by fear and hope. As you settle into your bed tonight, remember those who came before. Remember their resilience, their adaptability, their acceptance of what could not be changed, and perhaps take a small lesson from them. Rest does not require perfection. It requires surrender, trust, and the willingness to face another day. Sleep well and dream deeply, knowing that you are connected to all who have slept before you, and all who will sleep after. Good night once more. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams kind, and your mornings bright. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval sleep. Until we meet again, sleep well. And remember, history is always more human, more strange, and more beautiful than we can imagine. The end. Medieval nights were not silent. Even in the countryside, there were sounds. Wind, animals, the creak of wooden beams, the crackle of a dying fire. In towns and cities, there were more sounds. People talking, dogs barking, carts rolling over cobblestones, church bells ringing. But there was also intentional music. Lullabies existed, passed down through generations, sung by mothers to their children. These songs were simple, repetitive, and soothing. They helped children feel safe and fall asleep, despite the darkness and cold. Some lullabies were surprisingly dark, with lyrics about danger, death, and protection. They were not just meant to soothe, they were also meant to teach, to remind children of the world's dangers even as they drifted off. For adults, music before bed was less common, but not unheard of. Wealthy households might have minstrels or family members who played instruments. A soft melody on a lute or a gentle song could help ease the transition from wakefulness to sleep. Monks chanted before bed. The final prayers of Compline were sung in harmony, the voices blending together in the dark chapel. This music was meditative, designed to calm the mind and prepare the soul for sleep. There is evidence that music therapy was used for those who had trouble sleeping. Certain melodies were believed to balance the humors and promote rest. This was not based on science, but on observation. People noticed that music could change mood and affect the body. On the other hand, unwanted music, or noise, could ruin sleep. A neighbor's loud party, a drunken brawl in the street, or a traveling troupe of musicians performing late into the night could keep entire neighborhoods awake. In cities, night watchmen called out the hours, shouting, "All is well," or ringing bells to mark the passing of time. This was meant to be reassuring, but it also interrupted sleep regularly throughout the night. Church bells were constant. They rang for prayers, for deaths, for alarms, for celebrations. People became accustomed to them, learning to sleep through some and wake for others depending on the pattern of the bells. There were also natural sounds that affected sleep. In rural areas, the sounds of the forest at night, wind in the trees, animal calls, the rustle of leaves, created a soundscape that was both familiar and sometimes unsettling. Medieval people learned to interpret sounds in their sleep. A certain type of wind meant a storm was coming. A dog's bark pattern indicated whether it was a stranger or a familiar person approaching. The sound of hooves on the road could be a traveler, a messenger, or trouble. Sleep was never silent. It was always accompanied by the soundtrack of medieval life, a mix of natural and human-made sounds that shaped the experience of rest. Finally, let's talk about what medieval sleep teaches us today, because despite all the differences, there are lessons we can take from how our ancestors rested. First, the acceptance of waking at night. Medieval people did not panic when they woke up in the middle of the night. They used the time productively or restfully, then went back to sleep. Today, we often stress about middle-of-the-night waking, which makes it worse. Maybe we should take a page from the medieval book and simply accept it. Second, the importance of routine. Medieval people went to bed and woke up at roughly the same times, guided by natural light and social rhythms. We, with our artificial lights and screens, often ignore our natural rhythms. Returning to a more regular schedule might improve our sleep. Third, the communal aspect of sleep. While we value privacy, there was something comforting about the medieval practice of sleeping near loved ones. It provided warmth, safety, and connection. Some modern research suggests that co-sleeping or simply being near loved ones can improve sleep quality and emotional well-being. Fourth, the spiritual dimension of sleep. Medieval people took time before bed to reflect, pray, and let go of the day's worries. We could benefit from a similar practice, whether it is prayer, meditation, gratitude, journaling, or simply sitting in quiet reflection. Fifth, the resilience and adaptability of medieval sleepers. They dealt with discomfort, danger, and disruption every night, and yet they survived. It is a reminder that we are more adaptable than we think, and that perfect conditions are not required for rest. Sixth, the recognition that sleep is essential. Despite their many hardships, medieval people understood that sleep mattered. They protected it, valued it, and built their lives around the rhythms of rest and wakefulness. Finally, the humility of medieval sleep. There was no illusion of complete control. Medieval people knew they were vulnerable at night, dependent on God, luck, and the strength of their community. Today, we often approach sleep with the expectation that we can control it, optimize it, perfect it. Maybe there is wisdom in accepting that some things are beyond our control. Medieval sleep was hard, uncomfortable, and often frightening, but it was also deeply human, woven into the fabric of life, inseparable from work, family, faith, and survival. As you lie down tonight, in your safe, clean, comfortable bed, maybe take a moment to appreciate how far we have come, but also, perhaps consider what we have lost, the connection to natural rhythms, the acceptance of vulnerability, the communal experience of rest. Sleep throughout history has been essential, mysterious, and deeply personal. It connects us to our ancestors, to the natural world, and to something larger than ourselves. So rest well, dream peacefully, and remember that every night, when you close your eyes, you are participating in a ritual as old as humanity itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval sleep. May your rest be deep, your dreams kind, and your mornings bright. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, history is always more complicated and more human than we imagine. Good night.